Hello, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is Friends and Enemies. Today we're going to have in section 1 the case of the internal enemy. When we turn to the highest level of politics, we find ourselves confronted by something called the Great Game. Here we see great powers competing for influence and control. This game is often likened to chess, with each side playing a series of moves. It is usually a game of black and white pieces. The players of this game think in terms of hurting their enemy, which is the same thing as helping themselves. In other words, this is a zero-sum game. It is an I win, you lose type of game, opposed to the liberal economic game of let's make a deal so we can both win. This game is sometimes fought on battlefields with armies, navies, and air forces. It is also fought more subtly by spies and saboteurs, infiltrators, and agents of influence. This is SS General Walter Schellenberg, the youngest SS general in the Third Reich, and Himmler's favorite. Schellenberg was very intelligent, and he was a closet liberal who escaped the hangman's noose at Nuremberg because he had helped to save Jews, and he prevented a possible German invasion of Switzerland during the war. In fact, General Schellenberg was engaged in fighting a kind of civil war that raged inside the Third Reich among Hitler's minions. Schellenberg was famous for having a fortress desk, that is a desk with 9mm submachine guns mounted in it and a flip switch to activate those guns to clear his office. One might ask why Schellenberg would mount guns in his office desk. Let us turn to that reason. This is Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo from 1939 to 1945. He was responsible for hunting Soviet and Western spies inside the Third Reich. The main grouping of Soviet agents was a GRU network known as the Red Orchestra. While some of the orchestra's agents were captured and tortured, the network was never entirely broken. In fact, it had penetrated the German high command, had access to German battle plans, so that those plans often reached Stalin's desk before reaching the desks of the top German generals. Intelligent observers within the German government and high command knew the war was lost. With Hitler's foolish declaration of war on America after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the die was cast. The overwhelming strength of the United Nations coalition was bound to crush Germany. Here's some of the bad news Germany suffered in the spring of 1943. The destruction of 6th Army at Stalingrad, the loss of all the territory it had taken from Russia in 1942, the defeat of Rommel at El Alamein, the defeat of the Axis Army Group in Tunisia, the inability of the Italian Navy to hold the Med, Germany's inability to keep up losses of aircraft, the failure of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, and the Allied leaders' policy of unconditional surrender. It meant there was no way out for Germany. After all this bad news, Stalin's agents were free to recruit willing German officials. It is here that we come across an astonishing revelation. The head of SS counterintelligence, Heinrich Müller, attempted to recruit the head of SS foreign intelligence, Walter Schellenberg, to work for Stalin. Here is an excerpt from Walter Schellenberg's post-war memoirs. After a police conference, a strange conversation began. Quote, my first serious suspicions about the sincerity of Müller's work against Russia were roused by a long conversation I had with him in the spring of 1943, after a conference of foreign-based police attachés. Müller, with whom I stood more and more on a footing of enmity, had been especially correct and courteous that evening. I imagined, because it was so late, that he had been drinking when he said that he wanted to have a talk with me. He began talking about the Red Orchestra. He had occupied himself a great deal with the motives for these treason cases and with the intellectual background from which they stemmed. Here's what Müller said to Schellenberg in an attempt to recruit him. These are Müller's words as recounted by Schellenberg in his memoirs. Quote, you will agree with me, I suppose, this is Müller talking, that from your own experience, the Soviet influence in Western Europe does not exist among the working classes alone, that it's also gained a hold among educated people. I see in this an inevitable historical development of our era, particularly when you consider the spiritual anarchy of our Western culture, by which I mean to include the ideology of the Third Reich. National Socialism is nothing more than a sort of dung on this spiritual desert. In contrast to this, one sees that in Russia, a unified and really uncompromising spiritual and biological force is developing. The communist global aim of spiritual and material world revolution offers a sort of positive electrical charge to Western negativism. Mueller's talk continued. If we lose this war, it won't be because of any deficiencies in our war potential. It will be because of the spiritual incapacity of our leaders. We haven't got any real leaders. We do have a leader, the Führer, but that is the beginning and the end of it. Take the mob immediately below him, and what have you got? You've got them all squabbling amongst themselves night and day. Hitler seems to be exploiting this state of affairs in order to rule. That's where his greatest failure lies. I can't help it, but I'm forced more and more to the conclusion that Stalin does these things better. You see, with the Russians, one always knows where one is. Either they chop your head off right away or they hug you. But with us, everything is only half attempted and half done. Bormann is a man who knows what he wants. Of course, Mueller was referring to Martin Bormann, the Führer's assistant, and there'll be more on him later. Why, when trying to recruit Schellenberg to work for Stalin, did the head of the Gestapo bring up Martin Bormann's name? So here's what Schellenberg starts to think about this. This is a quote from Schellenberg's memoirs. I sat opposite Mueller that night deep in thought. Here was the man who had conducted the most ruthless and brutal struggle against communism in all its various forms, the man who, in his investigation of the Red Orchestra, had left no stone unturned. I was amazed to hear Mueller express such an opinion. He had always said that Bormann was nothing but a criminal, and now suddenly there was this change of attitude. I grew more and more nervous. He was knocking back one brandy after another, and in gutter Bavarian he began to revile the decadent West and the leaders, Goering, Goebbels, Ribbentrop, and Ley, till their ears must have burned. But Mueller knew all the most intimate details about every one of them. Schellenberg's question, what was Mueller driving at? And here's again from Schellenberg's memoirs, quote, what did he want, this man who was so full of bitterness and hatred, suddenly talking like a book? It was something I had never heard Mueller do before. Once, to steer the conversation on to a lighter and more jocular course, I said, all right, Comrade Mueller, let's all start by saying Heil Stalin right now, and our little father Mueller will become the head of the NKVD. He looked at me with a malevolent glint in his eyes. That would be fine, he said contemptuously in his heaviest Bavarian accent, and you'd really be for the high jump, you and your die-hard bourgeois friends. At the end of this strange conversation, I still could not work out what Mueller was driving at, but I was enlightened several months later. Conclusion. Schellenberg concluded that Mueller's thinking had never been nationalist, but communistic. Here again from Schellenberg's memoirs, quote, who knows how many people he, Mueller, influenced at this time and pulled over to the Eastern camp, that is, the communist camp. Quote, Mueller knew quite well that he had made no impression on me, that the truce which we had made for this one evening was over. I discovered towards the end of 1943 that he had established contact with the Russian Secret Service, so that quite apart from his personal antagonism, I had to reckon with the objective enmity of a fanatic. And the takeaway? Mueller was closely collaborating with Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary. Now here we're talking about enemies within. We're talking about traitors. This is a picture of Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and acting manager of the Nazi Party. It is now generally accepted by many intelligence historians and professionals that Martin Bormann was an agent of Stalin. Think of it for a moment. Hitler's number one go-to guy was a Soviet agent. Think of the maneuvering, the skill, the intrigue it took to get Martin Bormann into position as Hitler's secretary. Think of the head of the Gestapo, SS General Muller, being a Soviet agent and covering for Bormann. Think about the control they were acquiring within the Third Reich after the Battle of Stalingrad, after the defeat of Sixth Army, after the disaster of Rommel losing at El Alamein and the German 5th Panzer Army and Afrika Korps being destroyed in Tunisia. As the Red Army moved closer and closer to Germany, these men, Heinrich Müller and Martin Bormann, gained more and more power over the government around Hitler. They gained more and more control over Hitler himself. Yet they did not end the war. They wanted the war to continue so that Stalin's armies could reach the heart of Europe. You know, Stalin's main complaint at the end of the war was that his armies hadn't reached Paris, as the armies of Tsar Alexander had in 1814. This is Admiral William Canaris, a brilliant naval intelligence officer in chief of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, during World War II. Canaris was hanged on Hitler's orders at the end of the war because Hitler realized he had been working against the Führer for many years. In Moscow, the heads of the GRU and NKVD, meanwhile, feared Canaris. He was an anti-communist. They couldn't figure him out. He was an honorable person who not only attempted to thwart Hitler, but he was also working against the communists. Here's a quote from Canaris' deputy, the head of Foreign Armies East, General Reinhard Gehlen. Quote, Admiral Canaris came to my headquarters in Angerburg, and in the course of a lengthy conversation indicated whom he suspected the traitor, that is, within the Third Reich, was. What Canaris told me concerned Martin Bormann, who had been Hitler's personal secretary since early 1943 and chief of the Nazi Party organization. Martin Bormann was manipulating Hitler on behalf of Stalin. This is very clear from the book of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Louis Kilzer, author of the book Hitler's Traitor. Here is what Kilzer wrote about Bormann and Bormann's role in egging Hitler on. Quote, ever since Hess had flown to Scotland in May 1941, Bormann's role expanded geometrically. Nuremberg prosecutors would later call him a prime mover in the program of starvation, degradation, spoliation, and extermination of the Jews. Bormann's influence on Hitler had become pervasive. There were not only pogroms against the Jews, but against the Slavs as well. And Martin Bormann helped to engineer those pogroms because those pogroms helped Stalin. Many Russians wanted to fight against Stalin, but every atrocity, every pogrom pushed the Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians into Stalin's arms. Martin Bormann facilitated this process. Here we see Soviet General Vlasov, who defected to the German side. His troops were Russian troops who wanted to fight against communism, but they never got a chance because Hitler did not trust Russians in German uniforms. Well, thanks to Martin Bormann. After the war, British military historian John Fuller said that Hitler lost the war because he mistreated Russians and Ukrainians who would have gladly fought on his side. Schellenberg and Gehlen, as intelligence professionals, both recounted that pogroms against Slavs proved beneficial to Stalin. They earned the wrath of Martin Bormann for suggesting support for General Vlasov's All-Russian Liberation Army. Here is General Gehlen. This is what he wrote about Admiral Canaris' groundbreaking discovery in 1943. Quote, Canaris lacked proof of Martin Bormann's treason. Our suspicions were later confirmed when, independently of one another, we found that Bormann and his group were operating an unsupervised radio transmitter network and using it to send coded messages to Moscow. Look at this photograph of Martin Bormann. Look at how he's studying Hitler's face. Bormann was manipulating Hitler. Bormann was nudging him to do things that would ultimately benefit Joseph Stalin. Did Hitler suspect him? Would Hitler catch on? Bormann was against offering peace to the Allies, but he favored peace with Stalin. Bormann urged Hitler to put all his panzer divisions against the Americans in late 1944 in what became the Battle of the Bulge. This helped Stalin and hurt the Americans, and Bormann was the chief architect of the post-war Nazi International. Key points to keep in mind with Bormann are here listed, and we mustn't forget who Martin Bormann really was. Here's what historian Louis L. Schneider said about Bormann. He said Bormann was indeed the power behind Hitler's throne. Under his unprepossessing exterior was the classic manipulator, the anonymous power seeker who worked in secrecy and outmaneuvered all his rivals seeking Hitler's ear. And here's what General Franz Halder said about Germany's military intelligence failures during World War II. Quote, almost every offensive operation of ours was betrayed to the enemy even before it appeared on my desk. And now, to place Martin Bormann in context, we should explain that he was not Stalin's only agent in high places. In this picture we see here President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with his friend and co-president Harry Hopkins. It's believed by many researchers that Hopkins was a Soviet agent 19 in fact, and that Hopkins worked for Stalin throughout the war. In Major Jordan's diaries, where we read about materials for making an atomic bomb going to Soviet Russia, we find that Hopkins was the one responsible. When Soviet agents were detected infiltrating the Manhattan Project labs near Berkeley, California, Hopkins went and told the Soviets that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had found them out. Was Stalin manipulating FDR even as he was manipulating Hitler through agents of influence? Was Harry Hopkins and Martin Bormann those agents of influence? The takeaway from all this is that Moscow does not merely make war against you with armies. Moscow infiltrates your government and manipulates your leaders, manipulates your policy-making process. When you read the literature of those who suspect such manipulators, you're reading a literature full of famous names, like Harry Dexter White of the U.S. Treasury Department, and Alger Hiss of the State Department, of General Walter Bedell Smith, CIA director under Harry Truman, who fell under suspicion as a Soviet agent in 1953. Was Senator Joseph McCarthy crazy for suspecting the loyalty of General George Marshall? What about Walt Rostow and Henry Kissinger, who had accusations against them or contacts with communists? What about Bill and Hillary Clinton? What about Barack Obama, who was himself mentored by Frank Marshall Davis, a card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA? And then, what about Joe Biden? We may be in very big trouble here because the Russians in World War II were so successful they showed that they knew the way to place key people next to presidents, or maybe to place even people in the White House or in the German Chancellery. Ukraine and the war in Ukraine may now ultimately depend on spies in Washington and Berlin, rather than on Russian armies. So with this, we have a commercial break, but I thank you all for listening, and we'll continue into part 2. Our objective must be to defend society from its enemies. But who are its enemies? How can a society which agrees on nothing, whose diversity must be inclusive of everyone, defend itself? To answer this question, read The Fool and His Enemy by J.R. Nyquist, available on Amazon.com. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This is Friends and Enemies. This is part 2. Part 1, we covered internal enemies, internal subversive enemies, and now we're going to look at the grand strategy and tactics of America's enemies, the big picture, imagined and analyzed. First, we have to think about the unthinkable. Clausewitz. War is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Few people have the imagination for reality. Now, V.D. Sokolovsky. Marshal of the Soviet Union, quote, "From the point of view of weapons, a third world war will be a missile and nuclear war. The massive use of nuclear weapons will make the war unprecedentedly destructive and devastating. Entire states will be wiped from the face of the earth." Going back to Goethe for a moment, we have a failure of imagination. The collapse of communism. Really? They pull the flag down themselves? Think about it for a minute. There is Boris Yeltsin, a Politburo member. There is Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party Soviet Union, the President of the Soviet Union. He's going to pull down the red banner with a hammer and sickle from the Kremlin himself. Nobody pointing a gun at his head. No defeat in a war. He's just pulling the darn thing down. This is the Berlin Wall here, this picture, going down in 1989. All the people there. Now, that happened. That was a spontaneous event. But you know, they were planning, according to documents gotten by Vladimir Bukovsky, the Russian dissident, that they were planning to take the Berlin Wall down anyway in a day or two before this. They had passports already made. It was no big deal. They were surprised it happened this way. Oh, so what? Well, oh well. A lot of things went wrong when the Soviet Union fell. Not all according to plan. The liberalizing plan of the Communist Party itself, of Mikhail Gorbachev. What was he doing? He was liberalizing the Soviet Union. So we have to rectify this failure of imagination. So I'm going to help with this now, because when we imagine friends and enemies, we're thinking, oh, they're not communists anymore, they're our friends, right? Because the most basic thing in the world is if our friend Carl Schmitt, the writer of the concept of the political book, is right, the friend-enemy distinction is the decisive distinction. Okay, Russians and Chinese, no longer communists, they're our friends, they're just going into business. So, but wait a minute, there are Cuban, Russian, and Chinese troops in socialist Venezuela. Cuba is a communist country. They fully admit it. China is. What is Russia doing in this mix? Well, these are Russian troops? Russian anti-aircraft troops? Or are they sailors marching in Caracas, Venezuela? What's that? Now we have Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Ta-da! They represent Russia and China, and they are as one clenched fist. Defector Anatoly Golitsyn, KGB major, said that China and Russia were planning to unite in the future after the liberalization of the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Warsaw Pact. He said they would become close allies, which they have done. And he said it would be a moment where the balance of power in the world would change over to the communist bloc. And there they are, together. What a sight. Now, what I'm about to suggest, sorry, Mr. Camel, it's controversial. So, no spitting during the presentation. It's not going to be what you expect, although some people who know what I'm going to say are going to be like, oh yeah, we know what he's going to say. But no spitting, no contradicting, empty your mind, pretend you don't know anything, try to look at this with a fresh perspective. When the imagination plays tricks, okay, let's go back to this failure of imagination thing, what Goethe was saying. Okay, in your imagination, Reagan won the Cold War, right? But Reagan withdrew the Pershing missiles from Europe. We developed SDI and bankrupted the Soviets, but we never built SDI, and we helped Moscow. The Russians lost the war in Afghanistan, and it broke them. But Russia's Muslim puppets, Ahmad Shah Massoud and Rashid Dostum, captured Kabul from Najibullah. The reasons often given for our Cold War victory are mythological. Let's consider that idea for a moment, shall we? What is credulity? Credulity is when you believe one of the most ruthless, corrupt, murderous, and cynical ruling parties in all history voluntarily gives up power, oh boy, without a struggle. You got that? Can you catch him winking at you there? Now I'm going to talk about the Soviet strategy in the Brezhnev Committee. Soviet grand strategy. Wow, what a concept. Soviet strategy was updated in the fall of 1956 through the spring of 1957 by a committee under the direction of Leonid Brezhnev on account of the revolution in warfare brought on by the advent of the hydrogen bomb and rocket technology. The military subcommittee was headed by Marshal V.D. Sokolovsky, the military industry subcommittee by Dmitry Ustinov, the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee by Boris Ponomarov, and the Intelligence Subcommittee was headed by Nikolai Mironov. I want you to keep these names in mind. Not only did Brezhnev become very important later, that he became, after the fall of Khrushchev in 1964, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, but Marshal Sokolovsky would go on to edit a book called Soviet Military Strategy. And Nikolai Mironov would go on to discuss with his colleagues something based on Sun Tzu, and we're going to see how that resolves itself. Now something about Sokolovsky and his ideas of strategy. Sokolovsky was an extremely brilliant strategist. He was responsible for the Soviet war plan in the summer of 1944, which destroyed the German Army Group Center. It was probably the most picture-perfect military operation carried on out by the Soviets during World War II. Sokolovsky was a follower of Karl von Clausewitz, who we quoted at the beginning of this part of the episode. And pay attention carefully to Clausewitz's idea of strategy. Quote, "Now, philanthropists may easily imagine there is a skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without great bloodshed, and that this is the proper tendency of the art of war. However plausible this may appear, still is an error. It is an error which must be extirpated. For such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst." Here is Sokolovsky's manual for World War III. An updating of Clausewitz? Yes, it's all about the utmost use of force, what we just heard about. And here's a quote. "Modern strategic weapons make it possible to achieve decisive results in winning victory in a war, sometimes even without the resort to tactical and field forces and their weaponry." Now, Sokolovsky's manual for World War III continues. Missiles, missiles, missiles. Victory by nuclear bombardment. In a missile war, the main war aims and missions will be accomplished by strategic missile forces, which will deliver massive nuclear strikes. Ground forces, in conjunction with aircraft, will perform important strategic functions. KGB General Nikolai Mironov did not see strategy the same way as V.D. Sokolovsky, Marshal of the Soviet Union. Nikolai Mironov was not a follower of Clausewitz. He was a follower of Sun Tzu, who said, "All warfare is based on deception." And here's a quote from Sun Tzu. "Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." This is the opposite of what Clausewitz said, who said, in fact, Clausewitz said this idea is an error which must be extirpated. Now, Nikolai Mironov, as a student of Sun Tzu, became the chief strategist for the KGB strategy, the disinformation strategy, the deception strategy, the grand deception strategy of the Soviet Union. And this is a quote from KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn from his book, 1984 book called New Lies for Old. He wrote, quote, "In 1958, Mironov and Shelepin, who was at the time the head of the KGB, discussed with Khrushchev and Brezhnev the idea of transforming the KGB into a flexible, sophisticated, political weapon in support of policy as during NEP. NEP was Lenin's new economic policy, where the Soviet Union pretended to, or actually did, retreat into capitalism and used that politically to open relations with Western countries and get a foothold in those countries. Now, in terms of the false liberalization that would be necessary to have a second NEP, Golitsyn wrote, the liberalization in Eastern Europe would probably involve the return to power in Czechoslovakia of Dubček and his associates. If it should be extended to East Germany, demolition of the Berlin Wall might be contemplated. Think about one of our first slides, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall. The whole idea of deception is that they actually, according to Golitsyn's 1984 book, Mironov and Shelepin were thinking in terms of a future, preparing for a future liberalization and collapse of the Soviet Union. This is something we really have to keep in mind here. Mironov's advocacy of deception is described by Golitsyn in the following excerpts. Quote, a broader scale liberalization in the Soviet Union and elsewhere would have an even more profound effect, that is, than it did in the 1920s under Lenin. Quote, the Czechoslovaks might well take the initiative, along with the Romanians, in proposing the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. This, in fact, in terms of the Czechs and the Poles and the East Germans, in fact, took place. Quote, after successful use of the scissor strategy in the early stages of the final phase of policy, a Sino-Soviet reconciliation could be expected. Now remember, we saw those pictures of Putin and Xi being together. It is contemplated and implied by the long-range policy and the strategic disinformation on the split, the Sino-Soviet split. Now, I can't resist a comment on the synthesis of the Brezhnev Committee, the dialectics of the committee. The thesis here is the Sokolovsky-Clausewitz prepare to fight and win a nuclear war. That's the thesis. The antithesis is, no, we don't want to fight a nuclear war. We want to avoid the war by future liberalization of the USSR, a long-range deception policy. The synthesis is, you use both, an integration of both preparation for nuclear war and preparation for a long-range deception. So to underscore this, you prepare for nuclear war, plus you deceive the enemy into thinking that you're no longer communist, that you are no longer a threat, that you are now drunken Boris and the happy-go-lucky Russian Federation, and that's your Soviet Cold War strategy. You are building up to this deception so that the West will be disarmed and will not renew its nuclear arsenals, and that the East, China and Russia, will be thought to be divided, but they'll really be together, and they will be able to turn the strategic tables on the West. This also reminds me of something from Machiavelli. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that princes were educated by centaurs in mythology. A centaur is part man, part beast. Well, that means that princes must be able to act like human beings, but they must be able to be like beasts. And of the beasts, said Machiavelli, they must know how to be a lion to drive away the wolves and a fox to avoid traps. And that this was the ideal leader, a leader who was part human, part lion, and part fox. The West Strategic Zeitgeist, Part 1. Very funny, Boris. All right. From Victor Pelevin's Generation P, where he's depicting the changes in the Soviet Union as seen from the television screens of the news presenters. Quote, meanwhile, the television was still showing the same old repulsive physiognomies that had been sickening the viewers for the last 20 years. Now they were saying the exact same things they used to jail other people for, except they were far bolder, far more decisive and radical. Tatarsky found himself imagining Germany in 1946, with Dr. Goebbels shrieking hysterically on the radio about the abyss into which fascism had led the nation, with the former commandant of Auschwitz heading the commission for the detention of Nazi criminals, and SS generals explaining the importance of liberal values. Strategic Zeitgeist Part 2. It's a new kind of circus. The enemy? Greenhouse gases. Today, there's no greater threat to our planet than climate change. The zeitgeist of the shopping mall regime. I'm not evil. I'm just ahead of the curve. 5 strategic principles. 1. If someone wants to kill you, negotiate with them. 2. Don't worry, criminal dictators always keep their word. 3. If they break their word, pretend they didn't. 4. If they want nuclear weapons, give them money or trade deals instead. Number 5. Don't worry, they won't build nuclear weapons with the money you've given them. What it all means. Enmity is an outmoded concept because 1. The Cold War ended and we won. 2. Islam is a religion of peace. 3. China is a reliable trading partner. And 4. We do not need to build or maintain nuclear weapons. 5. We do not need borders, border walls, or even fences. And 6. The world can be as one, like in the John Lennon song. Now, let's remind everybody about the friend-enemy distinction here. The first rule of politics and grand strategy. Here's from Carl Schmitt's A Concept of the Political. The first rule of politics, grand strategy, is, quote, the substance of the political is contained in the context of a concrete antagonism. Words such as state, republic, society, class, as well as sovereignty are incomprehensible if one does not know exactly who is to be affected, combated, refuted, or negated by such a term. To the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. War is the existential negation of the enemy. It is the most extreme consequence of enmity. All political concepts, images, and terms have a polemical meaning. They are focused on a specific conflict and are bound to a concrete situation. The result is a friend-enemy grouping which turns into empty and ghost-like abstractions when this situation disappears. So we are dealing with, in terms of this deception strategy, both preparing for nuclear war and deception, we're dealing with an enemy, and a very deadly enemy. An enemy that wants to blind you and deceive you and trick you, and an enemy that was willing to nuke you because he's building a nuclear arsenal. So this is what we must keep in mind in our analysis here. A political concept without its enemy. This fellow, Georgy Arbatov, 1988, he comes to the campus, my campus, of UC Irvine, to our political colloquium, and he gives a speech in December 1988. This is what he says at UC Irvine in 1988. He is a former Stalin advisor. He is the head of the Soviet Union's Institute of USA and Canada Studies. And this is what he says. Our major secret weapon is to deprive you of an enemy. I'm going to read that again. Our major secret weapon is to deprive you of an enemy. He doesn't say that they aren't our enemy anymore. So much was built out of this role of the enemy. To have a really good empire, you have to have a really evil empire. What is important now is not the balance of power, but the balance of interests. So that was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, that Georgy Arbatov went to my school and said, we're going to take away the image of your enemy. You know, since when is there peace in our time? Everybody believed the end of the Cold War was like the end of history. No more bad things, no more wars. But I will remind you that the doors of the Temple of Janus were rarely closed. That's a quote from Plutarch. The Temple of Janus, its doors were closed only when there was peace in the Roman Empire, in the Roman Republic. There was rarely peace. rarely peace. So, talking about lions and foxes and all this thing, when the lion lies down with the lamb, well, what's wrong with this picture? Right? It's munch time. It's crunch time. So, I'm sorry, you sad clown. It is not what you thought. It is not the end of history, Francis Fukuyama to the contrary notwithstanding. The joke is on you. And that is a very important lesson that we have to learn. So many people were easily convinced of what they wanted to believe, that they wanted to believe that there was no higher purpose or strategy behind what Gorbachev was doing, that Gorbachev wasn't really a communist. He had betrayed his country, the Soviet Union. No, I'm sorry, it is not peace in our time. And now we see in the year 2023, no, it hasn't been. There's a major war going on in Europe at this moment. So whether it's this man, Neville Chamberlain on the left, trusting this man, Adolf Hitler on the right, or it's George W. Bush trusting former KGB Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin, it is the same game. It is a mistake. You are being tricked. It is all about strategy. When you believe a communist, it never turns out well. FDR and Stalin at Yalta, did it turn out well? Nixon opens the West to China. Did it turn out well? Look at China's trade wars versus the U.S. No. Once again, the lamb is lunch. And what did the fall of the Berlin Wall signify in this context? Angela Merkel, who was the longest reigning chancellor of Germany, I think, she had this funny background. She wasn't a West German, she was an East German. She wasn't a member of a Christian conservative organization, though she became mysteriously the head of the Christian Democratic Union in the unified Germany. She was a youth leader in the Communist Youth Organization of East Germany, the communist version of the Young Pioneers, the Boy Scouts, the Communist Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts of East Germany. And there she is, circled in red in this picture. What in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, it didn't just signify the collapse of communism. It signified a movement of communist structures becoming embedded in communist persons, becoming conservatives and embedding themselves in Western structures. People like Bill Clinton, Angela Merkel, Macron in France. The number of these people is rather large. In 1982, a top Czech communist defector, one of the top officials in communist Czechoslovakia, wrote a book. And in that book, he had a section on the strategy, the future strategy of the communist bloc. And he wrote, quote, "The erosion of NATO, begun in phase 2 of the long-range strategy, would be completed by the withdrawal of the United States from its commitment to the defense of Europe and by European hostility to military expenditure generated by economic recession. To this end, we envisaged that it might be necessary to dissolve the Warsaw Pact, in which event we had already prepared a web of bilateral defense arrangements to be supervised by secret committees of Comecon." Now, all their plans didn't work out the way they'd envisioned. This was, Shana had defected in 1968. This is how he understood it then. We know everything didn't work out the way they wanted, but this is the way they were thinking. They did collapse the Warsaw Pact. They did collapse the Soviet Union. They did bring down the Berlin Wall. Now, it backfired on them to some extent, but they stuck to their plan. They're with China. They're with Russia. They're in Central America. They're in Africa. They're taking over Latin America. Just look at the news. And so they never gave up. They never gave up. And how do we know they never gave up? The fall of communism. What's wrong with this picture? I'll give you 3 seconds. That statue of Lenin is being gently lowered. It is not being smashed to bits. And I remember a former KGB officer told me, he was working in Vienna at the time, he said, "We knew everything was under control when we saw this statue being lowered carefully, gently, not being broken to bits." In fact, it's not just Galitzin and myself and a few observers that think there was something wrong with the 1991 August coup that brought about the supposed end of the Soviet Union. Yevgenia Albats, she questioned it. She's a Russian journalist, and here's just a few items about her. She questioned the authenticity of the 91 coup. She believes that politicians and the public do not possess the tools needed to overcome a sophisticated monolithic secret service like the KGB. She says Russia was a police state even under Boris Yeltsin, that the West was fooled by Russia's democratic pretenses, that Russia is currently preparing for war against the USA, that Putin is unafraid to fight such a war, that Russia is being bombarded with anti-American propaganda 24/7. This is what she said just a few short years ago. And now, of course, Russia's already in a war and its armies are moving west. The revolutions in Eastern Europe, were they directed from Moscow? Here's a few data points. Documentary filmmaker Robert Buchar revealed that the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989 was directed on orders from Moscow. Andrei Cudrescu, a Romanian dissident and defector, in his book The Hole in the Flag, revealed that the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania was carried out by Soviet agents in the government and military. It is alleged that Polish Solidarity leader Lech Walesa was an agent of the communist secret police with the code name Bolek. Ukraine has had 3 anti-communist revolutions after 1991, but in each time the government turns out to have a Soviet composition and the revolution has to begin again until you get to 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity. And then what do the Russians do? They reacted by annexing Crimea, invading Donbass, and then in 2022 invading Ukraine as a whole, starting a major war in Europe. But isn't communism dead? We're told that only 5 communist countries now remain: the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the Laos People Democratic Republic, and the Republic of Cuba. Well, I'm going to argue that's not the case. Here's a list of some former Marxist countries that had deceptive constitutional changes at the end of the Cold War. First, Angola, which went through the pretense of adapting multi-party rule, yet the MPLA communists are still in charge of the country, which, by the way, is armed by Moscow. Zimbabwe kept its communist dictator. The Sandinista communists in Nicaragua agreed to abide by a democratic constitution after the Contra War, but they've since overthrown the constitution and are working closely with the Russians and the Cubans. In Namibia, which supposedly became a multi-party democracy under SWAPO. Well, SWAPO is still ruling there, and SWAPO, of course, is a communist organization. Mozambique is virtually a colony of communist China, and that, of course, was taken over by the communists in the 1980s. Countries the communists have taken since the Cold War ended. In Nepal, after a period of civil war, we saw the victory of the United Communist Party of Nepal Maoist. In Venezuela, the election of Hugo Chavez brought Latin America's biggest oil-producing nation into alignment with Cuba, Russia, and China. In 1997, communist rebels under Laurent Kabila ousted President Mobutu in Zaire, now called Congo. In 1994, the African National Congress took power in South Africa. The ANC, the African National Congress, is and was under the control of the South African Communist Party. The country is essentially a one-party state now, committed to socialism, aligned with, guess who, Russia and China. Bolivia is under the thumb of Evo Morales, a fanatical Marxist-Leninist. Is Russia still led by communists? This is an interesting question, and it's a decisive one because so many people say, oh no, Putin's a conservative, Putin's a nationalist. Well, let's look at what Russia has done internationally. Russia continues to support communist states and organizations worldwide. Russia supports the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, who's established a socialist dictatorship. Russia supports the Cuban-backed socialist regime in Venezuela. They've even sent troops, as we saw earlier, to Venezuela. Russia supports communist states in Africa, like Congo, Angola, and the ANC government in South Africa. And Russia has aligned itself militarily with communist China and communist North Korea. The Russian state media has been feeding the Russian people with a heavy dose of anti-Americanism since April 2014. And I forgot to mention, Russia, in this little blurb, Russia has been sending grain to Cuba, communist Cuba. And communist Cuba has been thanking the Russians for that. So everywhere there's a communist regime in the world, the Russians are giving some kind of aid or support and are coordinating with China and North Korea, etc. So the question is, was the collapse of communism a joke? Well, here you see Bill Clinton, who kind of came up through college as a Marxist radical. And there you see Boris Yeltsin, who was a candidate member of the Soviet Politburo. And it's a kind of jolly occasion, isn't it? Yeah. There is a KGB proverb. It says, a cat with a bell hung on its neck cannot catch mice. Pretty good, right? Let's go back to the strategy to the Brezhnev Committee that we discussed earlier. The strategy of combining preparation for nuclear war, which Marshal V.D. Sokolovsky advocated in the Brezhnev Committee, and a deception strategy where communism pretends to give up. That was Nikolai Mironov, KGB General Nikolai Mironov's strategy. What we see, whether it's from Golitsyn, Shana, these other defectors, all the events that we've seen unfolded, the actual way the revolutions occurred in Eastern Europe, the way communism continues to spread in Latin America and Africa and Asia, I think that this strategy is still in effect. I think that communist infiltration in the United States, in Western Europe, is continuing, and that we are being undermined here at home. That it isn't just a question of the armies of Russia and China. It is a question of the spies. Remember in part one, you had Martin Bormann being close to Adolf Hitler, being a Soviet agent. You have Harry Hopkins being close to FDR, being a Soviet agent. What have we got in the Biden administration today? What is that? And of course, this is what we're going to ask ourselves is looking at the Russians, looking at the Chinese leaders, but do they still believe in communism? Do they really believe in it? And there's this great little saying by the Danish physicist Niels Bohr. He tells the following story. A physicist visits a colleague and notices a horseshoe hanging on the wall above the entrance. Do you really believe that a horseshoe brings luck? He asks. No, replies the colleague, but I've been told that it works even if you don't believe in it. We forget that Marxism was not a belief system. What is believed in is a strategy, the power of strategy to reshape mankind, the power of a set of ideas to capture the multitude, to make them believe that they're going to be equal and free and everything's going to be like, well, a paradise on earth. This dream, which rots the soul right to the bottom and turns politics into a venue for saving mankind, is actually something that turns political processes into a giant grab for power. And this is where we get formations like the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, Communist China, Communist Cuba, and North Korea among the newly forming states. And we see the advance of socialist government concepts everywhere. And this advance is frightening. Now, here we see Vladimir Putin meeting with the former defense minister at the time, the defense minister of China, Chi Haoqian. General Chi met Putin in 18 January 2000. Chi turns out to be a major strategist and thinker on the side of the communist bloc. And we're going to take a look at his strategic ideas. About 20 years ago, General Chi gave a secret speech. And in this speech, he said the following. And this speech was given in front of, by the way, elite party cadres, top leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Quote, would the United States allow us to go out and gain living space? Note that General Chi said that China is overpopulated and needs living space. So I continue the quote. Quote, first, if the United States is firmly blocking us, how much more living space can we get? Very trivial. Only countries like the United States have vast land to serve our needs for mass colonization. Therefore, Chi continues, solving the issue of America is the key to solving all other issues. First, this makes it possible for us to have many people migrate there and even establish another China under the same leadership of the CCP. Thus you will understand why we constantly talk loudly about the Taiwan issue, but not the American issue. We all know the principle of doing one thing under the cover of doing another. And then later on in his speech, he says, one mountain does not allow two tigers to live together. And of course, in that he's referring to it's the United States or it's China. The two tigers, there has to only be one tiger. So the one that is going to be eliminated, he's saying, is going to be America. So now we come to the end. And this has been Friends and Enemies. I'm Jeff Nyquist again. And I'm just giving you a snippet here of this idea that we've lost sight of who our enemies are. We've also lost sight of the method of our enemy to infiltrate and get close to our top leaders. And we've also lost sight of the fact that they have this grand strategy, that a lot of the things that have happened in recent history were part of the strategy. And we haven't recognized that yet. We haven't recognized that they have China's building nuclear weapons and missiles like sausages, that Russia has renewed its nuclear armed forces and we haven't renewed ours. And that may not just be a coincidence. That may be part of a design. And the same design as the infiltration of our country by people who are supporting socialist and communist ideas. So I want to leave you with all this, and I know it's a lot to digest, but I hope you'll join me in the future for the next episode of Friends and Enemies. Thank you very much.